1944, and Nazi Germany's domination is coming to an end. However, in the final months of the devastating conflict, Hitler refuses to bow to the evidence of inevitable defeat. In a crazy attempt to alter the course of the war, in spite of the rout of the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, and of the Allied bombs raining down on Germany, Hitler keeps adding younger and younger recruits to the ranks of his already weakened army. After 5 years of war and fierce fighting, the Nazi regime has been destroyed by the firepower of the Allies. Germany is now a country without a government, and the majority of its cities have been turned to rubble. With the collapse of the Wehrmacht, thousands of German soldiers have been captured in every combat zone around Europe and held in prisoner camps, hastily built by the victorious side. There are 11 million German prisoners of war, 9 million displaced soldiers, and 1 million missing in action. Among them, children aged between 8 and 17. Surprised at how young these soldiers are, the Americans treat them from the outset with special attention, even though they are officially prisoners of war. Children have never before been used in this way for military purposes. So they are seen as victims of the Nazi regime, having been recruited and radicalized since they were very young. Around 10,000 of these Hitler Youth children are sent as prisoners of war to the Attichy Camp in the Oise region in northern France. They are separated from the adults and placed in a special section where they can be rehabilitated, called baby cages.
Baby cages. We were the only ones who knew what baby cages were. It was something quite extraordinary. Quite unique to Atichy. Atichy is a small village between Reims and Soissons in northeastern France. In Atichy at the time, that's to say in 1945, there was a huge German prisoner of war camp set up by the Americans. It really was a very big prisoner of war camp. For the Americans, it was probably the camp where they assembled all the youngsters, the children. I had my 17th birthday in the Attichy camp. My 17th birthday.
The generations who went through the war often find it difficult to talk about. It was just by chance during a conversation with my father, Winfried Börsch, that he told me about the School of Baby Cages and his first stay in France in the spring of 1945 in the Attichy prisoner of war camp. I started to take an interest in this rather unusual episode of history, and I realized that hardly anyone had even heard of it. Knowing that time was running out, and that there would be fewer and fewer witnesses left alive, I decided to film my father and listen to his story. Now aged 92, his experience as a prisoner of war was for him, paradoxically, the first step towards freedom.
Give me your hand, that's it. From 1943 onwards, almost every big German city was regularly bombarded by the Americans and the British. Hamburg, Cologne, Munich, and then Dresden. The Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe were short of soldiers and airmen, so they decided they would have to recruit schoolboys. The so-called German fatherland sent us to the anti-aircraft defense, which was part of the Luftwaffe. I was there from January 5th, 1944, until April 6th, 1945. Because on April 6th, all of us Luftwaffenhelfer, the auxiliary conscripts, were liberated by the Americans and made prisoners of war. Our childhood had been taken away from us. We hadn't had a normal life or the chance to grow up properly, and so on. What I really wanted to do was to become a musician, but we were sent to anti-aircraft defense. And to do what? Try and defend a city that was being bombarded by the Americans and the British. It was unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. When I was sent to Kassel as a Luftwaffenhelfer, I was only 15 years old, just 15. As the Americans closed in on Kassel, we thought, especially those of us who were youngsters, that since the war was virtually over, we would be returning home. But the SS told us that we had to take up a position in a field near Kassel to defend the area against a probable attack by American tanks. And in the field, there were dugouts already prepared. So there we were in the dugouts with rifles, but nobody knew how to use them. In each anti-aircraft defense battery unit, there was an NCO. Ours had been a medical student in civilian life. His name was Winfried Börsch. And so he decided that from that moment on, we were only to follow his orders. And we all followed him into the forest near Kassel. We hid under trees and so on. And then maybe after 5 or 6 days, we came across a sort of forest hut. Inside, there were lots of families, women and children. And they all shouted, "No, not in here, your soldiers, go away. If any Americans come, everyone will be shot. So go away, don't stay here," etc., etc. And then Manfred said, look at these so-called soldiers. They're just children, like you. They're just children. Let them sleep here just one night. They haven't been able to sleep for ages. So, in the end, we were allowed to stay and rest a bit. We were able to lie down and get some sleep. And then in the morning, around 6 o'clock, yes, around that time, we heard the sound of an engine outside. And we immediately thought that the SS had come for us, Luftwaffenhelfer. And we were sure that if they found us there, in our AAD uniforms, we'd almost certainly be executed on the spot. Executed. So that's what we thought would happen, and we started to say goodbye to everyone and so on. And as we were saying goodbye and good luck and everything, the door opened, and it was an American officer. We were surprised, and he looked at us, Luftwaffenhelfer, in our uniforms, and said, "You are now prisoners of war." Prisoners of war. So that's how it happened. We were made prisoners of war, and we were transported over to France, to the big American camp for German prisoners of war there.
France had been liberated, but the end of hostilities didn't put an end to the hard times, and the fate of German prisoners of war was not high on the agenda.
In the context of the liberation at the end of the war in 1945 in France, the subject of German war prisoners was both a French issue and an American issue, particularly concerning the prisoner camps. It was a French issue because the camps were in French territory, and an American issue because the camps that they had set up with German war prisoners were under American authority, and the French had no authority over them. From May 1945 onwards, but also before that actually, questions were raised about what to do with Germany after the war. What to do about this problematic country in the center of Europe. Were the same mistakes going to be made as those made after the First World War? Was a hard peace going to be imposed, or were the Allies going to try and inject a democratic spark into Germany? In the end, France, Britain, and the United States each had different ideas about what policy to adopt with West Germany. But it was the US that had the most pragmatic vision for post-war Germany in deciding to turn it into a bulwark against the communist bloc. War continued in the Pacific for the Americans. And so from May 1945, all efforts were made to transfer troops from Europe. The American war machinery needed backup, and so hundreds of thousands of German war prisoners worked building camps, not just for themselves, but also for the organization of returning American troops.
And then there was the problem of the young Germans, the Hitler Youth. Among them was Günter Grass, later Nobel Prize winner for literature, author of The Tin Drum, and he wrote, "We were too young to be Nazis, but we were old enough to be shaped by the regime." This showed that the post-war reconstruction of Germany would need to involve changing the mentalities of these young Germans, if possible.
The Americans came to realize this when they entered Germany and captured German soldiers en masse. For example, in the Ruhr Pocket in the spring of 1945. Straight away, these prisoners, including the very young ones, were removed from the combat zones, like all prisoners of wars, and taken to camps in France. There they were sorted into age groups.
How about the military training of this young man, Sergeant?
Was für Ausbildung haben Sie bekommen?
Haupttag,
Ja, und was noch?
Laser,
Haben Sie Waffen gehabt?
was?
Waffen, Feldwehr.
Nix. So nix.
Well, they just had close order drill, but they never had any training with weapons.
Has this youngster ever had any combat or ever been around combat with American troops?
Haben Sie gegen amerikanische Truppen schon gekämpft?
Was?
Haben Sie gegen Amerikaner gekämpft? Gekämpft?
Gekämpft?
Ja, gegen Amerikaner. Haben Sie geschossen gegen Amerikaner? Geschossen. So.
Nix, wir nix schossen.
Oh, they says they never fired a shot.
Never fired a shot. How old, what's the age of this boy?
Wie alt sind Sie?
12.
12 years old.
12 years of age, and he's had 3 years of military training. Well, Sergeant, I think we've finished with this young man. We'll put him back to PW cage with the other youngsters back there.
Also, das ist alles. Jetzt können Sie weg.
Alles? Alles.
In contrast with most of the other children, my father had grown up with a father who had been openly opposed to Nazism. He was part of the Confessing Church resistance movement.
It must not be forgotten that was in 1936. When my father died, he was a pastor in the Confessing Church and opposed the Nazi laws.
Hitler avait essayé de
Hitler had tried to win over the Protestants by creating a church that would answer to him. But not all Protestants were in agreement. And in fact, there was a whole group of pastors and devout Protestants who set up resistance.
In 1935, there were all the anti-Jewish laws. And my father, as a pastor, said that he absolutely couldn't accept them. And in the village where he was a pastor, there was a school teacher who was a rabid Nazi. And he always came to the church and wrote down everything that my father said during the service. And even before my father arrived home, the Gestapo were already there. And it was like that every Sunday.
The leading members of the Confessing Church were all massacred, beheaded by Hitler.
This is the sermon that my father gave on March 24th, 1935, at his church in Pitzewitz. And the title was, "Why, as German Christians, we are against a new religion." And the new religion was the ideology of National Socialism. My father was killed by the Gestapo on June 6, 1936, the same year that the Nazi government was recognized by the Americans, the British, and the French.
It's with great emotion, Marie, that I remember your grandfather, who didn't know that this would be his last sermon, and still went to deliver it that Sunday, to say, "I'm standing here before you. I can't do otherwise."
After delving into the history books, guided by my father's stories, I decided to go and visit the remains of the Attichy Camp, hoping to find more information about the infamous baby cages. My first stop was the old Attichy train station, which is now private property, to try and visualize the place where thousands of German prisoners of war had alighted. From the station, I followed the route that the prisoners would have taken all the way up to this huge expanse, looking out over the villages of Crotoy and Haute-Fontaine. There's nothing left here to suggest its eventful past, except for the ruins of an old control tower.
In 1939, the French army requisitioned this land from a handful of farmers in order to create an auxiliary landing site for the Air Force. It never got used. And then, when the German troops invaded France, this auxiliary land was commandeered again. And for more than 2 years, there was a weapons-free reconnaissance squadron posted here, in this treeless landscape. This land, then, had a third incarnation, when it was used to house the largest German prisoner of war camp in Western Europe.
Clearly, the camp was situated near the railway station for two reasons. Firstly, to be able to transport the war prisoners efficiently and quickly, and with the least fuss possible, but also to enable the prisoners to be moved easily to other camps.
We arrived by train. In open wagons. And when we crossed under bridges in Belgium and in France, people would stand there on the bridges and throw stones into the wagons at us.
The Americans had a very pragmatic view of how the camp should work and rapidly turned them into hotbeds of labor, essentially to serve the logistics of the American army along the main transport routes.
The Americans captured all the German soldiers, as well as us. And we were sent to a huge American camp on the Rhine, in Andernach. After that, we were transported by train to Namur in Belgium. And then from there, we were put on another train to France. And when this train stopped, we found ourselves at a tiny station near Attichy.
The prisoners had very little contact with the outside of the camp. Some of them didn't even know they were in Crotoy, because when they got off the train, all they saw was the name of the station, Attichy. Then they were marched up the hill, the Mont de Torche. They arrived at the camp and were locked inside. That was all they knew.
The Americans had a huge number of German prisoners of war to deal with. We had no idea how we were going to survive.
How did the inhabitants of the village react?
There were no problems at all with the villagers, because anyway, the prisoners were locked behind barbed wire fences. I remember that there were lots of youngsters, and they would walk up from Attichy station through the village, and we were just kids too. We followed behind them, and we picked up anything they might have dropped.
Even after the liberation, civilians had to get used to shortages and ration books. As for the prisoners, their status was subtly changed. They were no longer prisoners of war, which, according to the Geneva Convention, would have enabled them to have the same food rations as the soldiers on the front. So from then on, their rations got much smaller. The Crotoy camp, already nicknamed the Hunger Camp, certainly earned its nickname then.
Alors, faut imaginer ce camp.
This camp was basically a 1,200-meter by 600-meter quadrangle, where nothing could grow. The grass had completely disappeared under the prisoners' feet. There were tents as far as the eye could see, and a central alley from one end of the camp to the other. The camp was divided into 10 parts, or compounds, and in each compound, there were cages. The Attichy Camp was designed for 60,000 prisoners, although some said there were up to 100,000 at times, but that might be an exaggeration. The first thing to be done was to separate the younger boys from the lustful gaze of certain older prisoners.
The prisoner of war camps were vast, with prisoners on top of each other all day long. There was a whole range of ages, from 60 years old all the way down to youngsters.
I was 16 years old at the time, just turned 16. The Americans decided to separate the children. Whom they called babies, and put them into a special camp that they called the baby cages.
In some of the Red Cross reports, reading between the lines, certain practices went on, referred to as moral issues. It was quite common in prisoner of war camps to have a form of sexual trade between the men. Food would be exchanged in return for sexual favors.
And that's why the children were separated and put together in the baby cages.
Official information concerning the infamous baby cages is extremely rare, and so any witness accounts are all the more precious.
The baby cage of Atichy.
This account, written by one of the prisoners, designated by the camp administration as a teacher, describes the setting up of a rehabilitation program, despite the fact that no army in the world had ever been faced with such young and indoctrinated prisoners.
It was a very dark chapter in European history for young people during the Second World War. The shock of defeat was enormous, and prospects were very limited. Prospects for young people would come about slowly, led by those who had been rehabilitated by the Allies, but also by the churches, by Germans returning from exile, by the rare survivors of concentration camps, by returning politicians, social democrats who took up their roles in post-war Germany. These were the people who would help to rebuild German prospects.
According to this account, it was Joseph Wirth, ex-chancellor during the Weimar Republic and a Jew, exiled in the US since 1933, as well as being a member of the military intelligence service, who asked Karl Schiffer, another anti-Nazi, to organize the baby cages school. This is how he tells it. The Attichy Camp commander, Major William McGrath, was the spiritual father of the baby cages. Before being assigned to the huge American HQ in Reims, McGrath was both a father figure and social worker for the boys who were suffering physically and mentally. Captain Alfred C. Johnson then carried on the work of his predecessor with the same benevolence. According to the Red Cross report, dated August 1945, there were 7,421 young prisoners of war interned in Attichy. But in another account, the number was much nearer to 10,000 youngsters.
Regarding the organization of the camp, the Americans ran the administrative part of it with the outside world, and then there was a certain degree of internal self-management. It was a way of reintroducing the prisoners to democracy, to debate, to voting, and to other fair processes, so to speak.
Captain Francis Tortolo, a German teacher from the state of Rhode Island, was in charge of running the rehabilitation program, based on the methods that had been used in the US since 1944, in the German prisoner of war camp at Fort Getty. All the other subjects were taught by 150 designated teachers amongst the camp prisoners.
They played sport. They sang. They learned history. But it was the history of the US that they learned, and not German history. American history had a rich past dealing in democratic values, and this was the history intended to be taught. On the other hand, the Germans only had the short-lived Weimar Republic to look back on, and it had been discredited and blamed. So the task was to make the young Germans understand democratic values and teach them to obey in other ways than just in a military way. This is why Francis Tourtelot insisted that the greeting, "Good day, sir," should replace the military salute.
Once a week, black American soldiers, it was always the black soldiers, took us out of the camp for a while. So it felt a bit like freedom, especially as those black soldiers would give us chocolate and sweets and so on. We were allowed to go walking in the Champagne region.
At the time of the Second World War, the USA was a country where racial segregation took place, and this applied also within the American army sent to Europe to fight against Nazi Germany. So there were plenty of situations where German soldiers found themselves in contact with black American soldiers. Both sets of soldiers were marginalized by the American army. The war prisoners, because they were just that, prisoners, and the black soldiers who were discriminated against within their own army. This situation sometimes created affinities between the two groups.
The black American soldiers were more sympathetic. They were forbidden to give cigarettes to the prisoners. So they just lit them and dropped them on the ground. Rather than giving them cigarettes, they left them there to be picked up. They didn't actually hand them to the prisoners.
But in the end, Tourtelot, the head teacher, decided that the boys shouldn't smoke for the sake of their health, and he removed the cigarette rations. And it seemed like democracy had started to have an effect, because around 300 youngsters went as a delegation to complain, demanding to know who had made the decision. And when Tourtelot gave them short shrift and sent them on their way, they reacted by shouting, "Beat him up! Throw him into the ditch!" So this outburst was perhaps a good sign, a sign that the project was bearing fruit. And they were deprived of breakfast as punishment.
What we kept telling each other was that we hoped we'd be freed before our 17th birthdays. Notre 17e anniversaire, parce que après, because once you were 18, the Americans would send you to the French camps. Eu l'habitude d'envoyer tous ces gens-là dans des camps français. And French camps wouldn't be much fun.
There were two camps in Attichy, the one for adult prisoners of war and the baby cages, where there were young boys who had taken part in the war and for whom the Americans made a huge effort to help them deal with the dreadful things they'd been through. The juxtaposition of these two different forces, one which was destroying men through hunger, and the other which was saving young boys through education in the baby cages, is something that's hard to come to terms with.
Are you Monsieur Herbelin?
Yes?
My father was a prisoner of war in the camp nearby. That's why I've come to see you.
I beg your pardon?
Did you have any contact with the prisoners?
No, very little.
Very little.
No, they were locked inside the compound up on the plateau. There was just one entrance. The camp and the administration block were all grouped together in barracks. It was very cold in winter, and in the summer it was very hot. I don't know how they managed to live in conditions like that.
Did you ever hear of the baby cages?
The what?
The baby cages?
I don't remember.
What is known for sure is that the boys had slightly better living conditions than the other prisoners, particularly concerning food. Nevertheless, boredom was a huge issue for the prisoners. The boys did have a few board games at their disposal, but in the images shot for Life magazine, we can see them just lying on blankets, trying in vain to get some sleep. They could also find comfort in religion, thanks to the pastors that had been recruited, who had been vetted for being anti-Nazi, and who were guaranteed not to spread the wrong messages. This enabled a certain escapism for the boys and helped them to maintain contact with Germany, not through the prism of war, but through messages of peace and hope.
The pastor's mission was to help the boys who had no news from their families to deal with their distress and enable them to reconstruct in accordance with Christian values.
The American camp administration brought together all the prisoners whom they considered were in need of religious instruction and put them in the baby cages.
Ils étaient réunis dans le baby cage. Ça a été le chaplain américain.
That was the American chaplain, and those were the pastors. Pastors who were prisoners, and they had a special tent.
Les théologiens avaient une véritable tente.
There was a special tent for the pastors, and we were allowed to go in there, down underground. It was almost like a big courtroom, with a large library that had been donated by the Swiss Red Cross and the Paris Red Cross. A gift from the Ecumenical Commission for the Salvation of War Prisoners. And then we studied the Old Testament and Hebrew. I learned Hebrew in Atichy.
It was possible for the ones who really wanted to pick up their studies again, but it mustn't be forgotten that many had abandoned their studies to go to war. So the gap between their life as young students and the brutal reality of war was a very difficult one to fill.
I was moved by the poems that they wrote.
If I was a bird, I'd fly like an arrow up into the sky, back to my dear fatherland. Are my parents still alive? Is the house still standing? Are they all well? I get no answer. I'm a prisoner, and I must wait.
They were also really keen on playing music.
They learnt about the major Jewish composers, artists, and writers who had been banned by the Nazi regime.
Musical instruments were brought from Paris, and some of them wrote pieces of music, which I found quite extraordinary.
There was even a stage for concerts and theatre plays. Culture was not the only way that the prisoners learnt freedom. There was also a court system, organised and run by the young prisoners themselves, which dealt with legal and democratic issues. The court was made up of 12 young judges, with a 17-year-old presiding judge and a defense lawyer for anyone accused of having broken camp rules. All the Red Cross reports confirm that discipline was rigorously followed in the baby cages.
There was even a rather ambitious philosophy course, including Plato's works, for example. For these kids who were around 15 years old and who'd been taken out of school, the damage that the war had done to them was probably underestimated. But ultimately, what was important was that everyone could find something they liked.
I was also moved to hear about their confirmation. As you know, they'd been under the supervision of pastors. And then I found out that the Bishop of Beauvais, Monseigneur Rader, had come on August 15th to confirm the young boys. And that was quite extraordinary.
I was lucky to see both sides, inside and outside of the baby cages. Everyday life on the one hand, and then on the other hand, because I was one of the baby cage's representatives, I also had special privileges within the baby cages.
So how many people were there like you with a privileged situation and of your age in each tent?
I was the only person there, just me.
Just you inside the tent?
Just me. I was the only baby in the tent.
The fact that he was the only boy in the pastor's tent is not that improbable. He was the son of a pastor himself, and even though the confessing church was secret, the members would have known each other, so they would have recognized his family name and knew straight away who his father was.
I found the photos.
Of Atichy?
Yes.
Of the camp?
Yes. Of the camp. Do you want to see them?
Yes.
This is an article from the American Life magazine.
Oh, my goodness. Extraordinary.
Do you recognize it?
POW. This is amazing. And what's this then?
The crates of food.
Oh, goodness. Yes. Yes. The Hitler Youth. Oh, yes, look.
Do you recognize them?
The tents. The tents, I don't believe it. That's exactly it.
Was that how they were?
Yes, that's how they were. The tents. That's exactly how they were, yes. The pastor's tent was also like that, but it had a lower level dug into the ground. And all these thousands. It's awful.
In the pastor's tent, not only did my father have to study, but he was also in charge of carrying out social work for some of the boys with psychological issues, particularly the youngest ones. This excused him from having to reply to Captain Tortolo's questionnaire, the existence of which he was totally unaware, until I told him about it.
Questionnaires were distributed to both young and old Germans who would be returning to their country. There were questions such as, did Hitler deserve to be hanged in public? Amongst the youngsters, more than 20% replied no.
Was Hitler a great idealist? So, there were 2,254 yeses and 4,024 no's.
The young boys were shown films, including several films showing the liberation of the concentration camps, with all the disturbing images. One would have thought that they would have all given up their indoctrination, but no. When they were asked if they thought it was acceptable for a German to marry a Jew, most replied that it was, but over a third said that they would be offended.
If Germany had won the war, would we now be acclaiming the Führer? 3,138 replied yes, and 2,414 replied no.
Are these the replies that some of the young boys gave?
Yes, exactly.
It looks like there were some who said, "We hate Hitler. We hate Hitler."
The rehabilitation program lasted several months, but it's very difficult to judge how good it was. It was possibly carried out for propaganda reasons. After all, we were at the beginning of the Cold War. And one of the aims would have been to demonstrate to the boys the benefits of democracy in order to prevent them turning to communism, especially as relations with the former ally had turned very nasty.
At the end of that very hot summer, there was a storm that flooded the camp, and it was clear that lessons wouldn't be able to continue during the autumn, let alone the winter. The boys were increasingly worried, and in order to speed up the repatriation process, a series of meetings were organized between the German representatives in the baby cages and the camp commander. Ultimately, it was decided that the young prisoners should return home. At the beginning of September, a trumpet sounded the long-awaited signal to return home, and cries of joy resonated throughout the camp. Robert Levinson, a doctor in the American Army, wrote about the rehabilitation experience of the baby cages in a letter to a friend. "We have succeeded in winning the battles that won the war for us. I'm not so optimistic about winning the peace. Today, as medical inspector, I accompanied to their trains the first batch of German POWs, the youngsters, age range from 12 years to 17, for repatriation to Germany. My feeling in last hour association with them was that of failure. The little done was due to personal interest of 2 or 3 American officers and enlisted men at the camp. These German youth have learned well the catechism of Nazism. The concept of democracy and practice are too great a mental effort for cerebrums so deeply narcotized."
The story of Attichy is, however you look at it, the story of the baby cages. It's a story of humanity and of love that has to be told.
There's no one else alive who could tell the story of what went on at the time.
My father could.
Yes, your father, of course.
The only person we found.
Really? I'm still shocked that a young man of 16 should be kept prisoner there. It's hard to imagine.
For the Americans, the baby cages was a humanitarian project, an act of love for one's neighbor, directed towards the young Germans, and totally different from what the young Germans had known up to then, which was the preaching of hate. Hate for everyone around them, except for Nazis themselves.
My father was lucky that he came from Marburg, one of the few German cities spared from Allied bombs, and that's where he was reunited with his family. Having picked up his studies in the baby cages, he then decided to learn French, and a few years later, he married a French woman. Do you know what my parents did when they got married?
No?
We went to Verdun for our honeymoon.
That would have been something quite significant. Yes.
So to Verdun, and then to Fort Douaumont.
Wow. Wow. A honeymoon in Verdun. I think that's just... I'm speechless.
And then we settled down there, hoping that this would never happen again. Long live peace, long live peace.
Vive la paix.
Even if the results of the improvised and short-lived baby cages experiment didn't match expectations, it nevertheless enabled 10,000 soldiers to forget the horrors of war for several months and to be given a glimpse, through education, of another life. As a university professor, Winfried Börsch was one of the first architects of the twinning scheme between French and German towns.
The Americans kept us prisoners in a very, I think it's true to say, in a very humane way. Once a week, we were allowed to leave the camp and the barbed wire. I told myself that I would really like to learn the language of this country. This country in which I experienced these moments of freedom.